Stephanie Wood. She's director of the Wired Humanities Project here at the University of Oregon. She's co-principal investigator of a 3-year NEH-NSF-funded project to build an online Nahuatl dictionary, and is the author of numerous publications, including Transcending Conquest, Nahuatl Views of Spanish Colonial Mexico. Stephanie will talk to us about that and share her ideas.
Thank you. Okay. So I was invited to share one of our projects today, and so the dictionary was chosen, but actually could have talked to you about a corpus of manuscripts, but that project interfaces with this one. So I hope those of you who are here who are especially interested in manuscripts will find something of interest here. This is the URL for the dictionary project. It's already online, and we're nearing the 3rd year of completion of a 3-year grant. So it's still very much under development, and you'll still see errors. We have 2 proofreaders working on it, but we have over 29,000 headwords with massive amounts of information for some of those headwords. So this is a Documenting Endangered Languages NEH-NSF grant, which is wonderful economic support, and it has allowed an international collaboration. I'm actually the PI, not the co-PI, but I have some sort of sub-awards. And this is one of various projects that we at the Wired Humanities Projects, which is now housed here in this library, have been developing. We've had over $1 million in grants in the last few years, and the center itself was one of the first in the country. I can remember when you could count on one hand the digital humanities centers. It was called Humanities Computing then, and then a few years ago got renamed, sort of. And although there's still the Humanities Computing Association and so on. And so I joined in '99, so I'm not the founder, but I think it's a very exciting field to be in. My own research is with indigenous languages and indigenous language manuscripts of early Mexico. And the project I'm going to speak to you about today is Nahuatl is the #1 indigenous language numerically in Mexico, with 2 to 4 million speakers. We can't be exact because when the census takers go around and count speakers, people shy away from admitting they speak this because it has historically had a pejorative reading, unfortunately. The language is rapidly declining, even though it's the largest, and that's how we were able to convince the funders that it is endangered, seriously endangered, in large part because of migration to cities where Spanish dominates and mass media, many reasons. Also because of the heritage of a lack of respect. So there is a counter movement to revitalize and teach Nahuatl in the schools in Mexico City. It's been decreed that Nahuatl must be taught now in the schools. The funds haven't been given to make that happen, to hire those teachers and create those textbooks and other resources. But I'm at least hopeful that there's this counter move taking place. Both working with native speakers in Mexico, but many of them migrate out of Mexico. So we have in North Carolina large numbers of Nahuatl speakers, and in other pockets here and there in the United States. This was one of only a few indigenous languages for which we have texts in great abundance across the Americas. There are more texts in Nahuatl than in any other indigenous language, especially historical texts. And textual production is now on the increase again, and our hope is to create, in this dictionary and some of our other projects, materials for instruction and independent learning by putting them free and online, so anyone can use them anywhere, and to support multidisciplinary research for linguists, but historians and many other people. So I'm a historian, and my goal is to bring greater balance to the historical record by bringing indigenous voices and perspectives to the fore, things that were just a generation ago ignored, and so now finally beginning to get an audience. Here's a picture of some of our collaborators, and on the left there's Professor Delfina de la Cruz with the orange and red sweater on. our university asks when you work with native speakers to get signed human subjects form, and they repeatedly refuse. We are not your subjects, we are your collaborators, and I love that attitude. I agree. They are scholars now reaching the universities and collaborating in very significant research projects. It's true there aren't enough. There aren't enough of the native speaker scholars, but they're growing in number, and I'm very excited about that. The other significant online Nahuatl dictionary is this one in French, and I use it constantly, and so I would never criticize it, but I do believe ours is better and offers things that this one online doesn't. For one thing, this is a long alphabetical list that you scroll and scroll before you find the page for words beginning in T, and then you scroll and scroll and scroll, or once you get to that page you can do a find and find a word, but it's not as functional, and also because it's in French and there's some Spanish and English, and there's no interface for native speakers. Indigenous people are not using this, and I think that's kind of sad, again, considering we're trying to keep and preserve and revitalize the language. So our dictionary is a number of relational databases with integrated searching. It's trilingual at the moment, but we would like to bring in French and German and other languages. Each part could stand alone, or you can have it all. That's another great thing about digital technology, is you can sort of create massive databases and then choose and be selective about how you're going to serve it, what you're going to serve together, and create interfaces that have lots of different options. One option is to have a monolingual Nahuatl dictionary, which has never ever existed in 500 years of colonization. Any dictionary, really shouldn't call them dictionaries, lexicons that have been created are basically vocabulary lists of, say, Nahuatl words translated to Spanish or what have you. That the colonial environment is what drove the nature of these lexical variations. And so now we have actual Nahuatl word with a Nahuatl definition in Nahuatl, with sample sentences in Nahuatl. And that's never before existed. So we're very excited and proud of that. So of course we had this all in English and in Spanish as well, but it's never existed for native speakers. And so, just we take for granted a dictionary of English, say, you're kind of not sure what a word means, and you can go look it up. Now they can do that, and that's the first time ever. This is the interface for the Nahuatl version, and it was interesting working with various collaborators to come up with how to describe, click here, how to come up with the language for an interface in Nahuatl. And the group that created this said this is very fluid. We can modify this if users say that doesn't make sense to me. And there are a great many variants of Nahuatl, so it's likely that will be people who don't get some of the language here. But they really didn't want to use loan words. They were really, of course, click here, clic in Spanish. They all know what that means, and they could put that there. And maybe in the end that we'll have to go back to using some loan words, because I think sometimes studiously avoiding loan words doesn't make sense. Here's the Spanish language interface. So this is a collaboration between Mexicans, as I've shown already, but also European scholars are working with us, and basically we're receiving large amounts of data that we have to work to merge, and technology helps with that a lot too. We are combining modern Nahuatl with the what's called classical or colonial or early Nahuatl. As I mentioned already, multidisciplinary purposes. And besides providing the definitions and usage in a sentence, we are providing attestations from manuscripts. That's the classical component, because there are thousands of manuscripts that are coming out now in translation into English or Spanish primarily. And so we're looking for particular words and how they are tested in different places and different times, and recording that, feeding that into the dictionary. So it's really much more than a dictionary, but a digital philological tool for the study of the evolving language and meaning. We are also including and developing now pictographical representations of words and audio from native speakers, different places and different times, so we can again hear variation in pronunciation over time. Video, something relatively new. Our native speaker partners are creating short videos of conversations and putting them on YouTube, and then we link to them. Next phase coming, we hope, our current grant ends in June 30th, so we're writing another grant proposal. We want to include thesaurus, and there's a big loanword project in Poland going on that we would like to fold into this. So lots of things on the horizon. In trying to think about textualities and the questions that were raised for today, one of the interesting things in working with indigenous languages is the broad range of what you could call writing. And so in pre-classic times, you get this sort of there's a roll-out stamp, and when you put ink on it and roll it out, that's what you'll see. And there are on the right-hand side, there's a bird, obviously, and on the right, those some sort of glyphic elements or pre-glyphic elements. And over here, another pre-classic text from southern Mexico. So different forms of writing were evolving over time. Lower left, that's Nahuatl pictography. So it's constantly changing. The most sophisticated semioasiographic texts come from the Maya, and there we still have a few pre-Columbian manuscripts with this form of writing, and then it continued. Let's say it's being revived, and it's under continuous analysis. And this one manuscript shows three different kinds of sort of writing: glyphic writing, numerical annotation, and pictorial messages that are very heavily embedded with meaning that, it takes what we call iconography to tease out what is being said there. But just to show you, Maya glyphs have very interesting structures, and this is just, again, the past generation that we're coming to figure this out now. About 80 to 90% of glyphs can be translated now, but that was not the case when I was an undergraduate. So this is how recent these developments are. And you have the idealized structure on the left there, an example of a real glyph on the right, and there's just so many variations. So you can't predict the structure of a glyph, but you can database the elements. And I was just in Mexico working with a Mayan epigrapher and figuring out how we might create a database of Maya glyphs, which is basically, a glyph has to be like an image to which you would attach text to the various components and make each component searchable as well as the whole, and then all the text that's attached. So it's a really fun challenge. We were very honored to be invited to be a part of the text image linking environment experiment at Myth in Maryland, and because we offer such unusual, some of our manuscripts, the text winds around like a coil, or it goes around the page and then a different direction, and so attaching, isolating on a page one line and attaching a transcription to that one line, that's great, and we're very excited about that, but they had a very hard time with the material we were bringing to them. And so they haven't really fully solved it, and so we continue to kind of try to develop our own systems for breaking down the elements of pictography and attaching text. But here's an example of Nahuatl pictography again. And so you get Cuauhitl, which means tree, and Titlantli. So Cuautitlan is the name of a town, and that's how they would show it pictographically. Just the red arrows isolating one example for you there. Mostly I work with alphabetic texts, but they do have this pictography woven in, so you constantly have to be prepared for that addition. And then, as with any manuscript, you've tears and stains and lost pages, and huge variety in orthography. That there's no standard, as we've already heard, for medieval and early modern manuscripts in Europe. It's similar. So, in the case of the Nahuas, the European friars arrived in the early 16th century and taught them to write their language with the Roman alphabet. So that's how we get these. You could probably make out the first word there says memoria. So there's a loan word, and then it takes off in Nahuatl. And but it's not exactly, it's the same alphabet, but they didn't use all the letters. So it's a more restricted alphabet. But it certainly helps that it's that it's a European alphabet in terms of trying to transcribe and translate it today. So alphabetic writing in Nahuatl, in its heyday, was from about 1540 to 1830, and now reviving. And there are approximately 20,000 manuscripts in Nahuatl in archives today. As I said, pictorial elements continue to appear within the alphabetic writing, no fixed orthography. It's increasingly infused over time with loanwords from Spanish, which are Nahuatlized to a point where you can hardly recognize them anymore. And I think that is the most difficult challenge in transcribing and translating, is when you come upon Spanish So for instance, just to throw a little, since there's so many Romance languages faculty here today, I would just say it would be great to teach Nahuatl within the Romance languages department, because Spanish is so much present, and knowing Spanish is so essential for translating Nahuatl. The friars had two approaches. One was, oh, these texts are texts of the devil, so let's burn them. So on the what you have on the left is a Nahuatl view of friars burning their manuscripts. On the right, you have Bernardino de Sahagún, who thought, well, if we want to convert these people to Christianity, we have to study their culture so we can root out those, we'll know to recognize and get rid of those devilish elements. So he created the massive Florentine Codex, which is like a huge encyclopedia. I say he created it. He invited his Nahuatl students to write it and illustrate it. And so, he really kicked things off in a big way. But it got so there were Nahuatl scribes in every tiny village, and all busy writing about their daily lives. Females, on the lower left there, fairly rare, mostly male scribes. Here's how we will bring in the pictography and attach text to it, but this is linked with the headword and all the attestations from manuscripts that are in text form as well. An example of how we're dealing with orthographic variants. Currently we have an orthographic variant field. So you can see how O and U are interchangeable, and single versus double L in Nahuatl, they were both pronounced the same. Unlike in Spanish, the double L would be like a Y sound. So, we're feeding in as we find the variants, but we're also developing behind the scenes scripts where automatically, if someone just entered any one of those spellings, even if our headword doesn't have that spelling, the word will come up. So we already have some scripts that are doing that, and we're going to make that broader, more comprehensive. Loanwords, as I said, also doing the same, because for instance, fresada, which comes from Spanish, sometimes also today pronounced frasada, the FR, those letters were not taken into Nahuatl. So when they had a loan word that involved that kind of complicated spelling and pronunciation, the variants are really all over the map, and presada. People look at that in Mexico today and go, what word is that? Okay. So we're going to have to develop special scripts for recognizing loan word variants. Audio files, as I mentioned, we mark with who said it, when, and where, because it really does. Languages evolve, and we want to capture that historical evolution. Video, as I mentioned, going up on YouTube. So we're getting them to put a transcription of what they're saying, in sort of subtitle form. We also would like them to do it in English and Spanish, but I don't know how far we'll get eventually. I hope we'll have that. But so we can bring in the examples and explain by attaching text, what is a key word that comes up in this particular sentence. We're also encouraging the participants to tweet in Nahuatl, and hope to be archiving that. We still actually aren't archiving it, and tweets just kind of go poof after a couple months, they disappear. I hope that's going to change where it will become available. Facebook, we find that young people are excited about writing in Nahuatl if they can use the social media that they love so much, and they're already using it in Spanish, many of them, so now they're starting to write in Nahuatl, and we're just so excited. And we created a listserv where we have over 60 participants now, just to encourage lots of writing and exchange in Nahuatl, which we are archiving there, and we will extract for the dictionary. Now, as a teaching resource, we are marking for example, our manuscript attestations with themes that may arise and may be of interest to teachers. So Tliltic, which means black person, Judío, which is a loan word, Chichimeca is like an early non-sedentary hunter-gatherer indigenous type, but also valiant warriors. So just following, if you're interested in race or ethnicity, following these kinds of terms and can be very rich. Or the meaning of conquest. They had a pre-Columbian word for it, because the Aztecs were great conquerors of their neighbors, and they were hated by many of their neighbors, and that's why the Spaniards could come in and conquer the Aztecs so easily, because they got all these allies to help them get rid of the hated Aztecs. Loanword studies of things like Diablo, religion, things like that. So we're marking those with preset themes. Sometimes people arrive at a dictionary, here, enter your search, and people are like, I don't even know what to search. I don't even know what word in Nahuatl, what are words in Nahuatl. So You can, by the way, you can enter an English or a Spanish word or a Nahuatl word in the main search box, and there are more sophisticated search pages. But we did set some themes. So for people like, oh, I'm going to browse. Okay, well, I'm interested in music, so I'm going to see what they have. And then you get a whole list of things, including, say, this drum. And then you can see, here's where I've been talking about manuscript attestations with citations for each bit, so that the person could go back to the original and read more, widely around the example if they want to. So we have them sorted in translations into English, translations into Spanish, and down the road, I hope, German, French, others. Data entry is very different. If you're interacting with the database yourself versus drawing from it for the online publication. We have a lot of fields. This is just one of many various data entry pages, fields where you can put your examples, and we have our authorities, and we have, this word already existed, and somebody made a new entry for it, but we need to merge those, so that's the duplicate removal element that you're seeing down here. So there's a lot going on in this page. Since TEI has come up, I just thought I would show that we are using TEI. These days you can use XML as though it's a database. You don't even have to have a database with set fields. You can just wrap your text with all this encoding, and in a way it becomes a database that then you just serve. But we already had our database, so we thought, well, we still want to have the XML there for people who are online, web crawling, looking for things that are encoded. We want to be counted there and have the standard. So we actually, kind of like with the T-Pen thing, we created an interface where our collaborators, maybe they don't know encoding, and I don't think any of them do really, can just enter the data in our database fields, and we are bracketing those fields with XML, so encoding, so that it becomes transformed for them. And then we have these calculations that are complicated. And I just wanted to say thank you to Luke Hollis. You're not here today, are you, Luke? Oh, over there. Hi. So this is a graduate student in English who is our guru with the TEI encoding in this part. And maybe if there were time during the questions, would you be willing to answer questions about this, Luke? Put you on the spot. I also want to thank Ginny White, our technical assistant, who worked with us also in creating this TEI encoding. So you can see that there's a complicated behind-the-scenes element here. And I think this may be my last slide, but showing how, as I mentioned, we're getting data sets contributed, and then figuring out how to fold them in with what's there. We're using sort of the head word as the basis for bringing things together, and because head words in this one set they're using one orthography, in this other data set they're using a different one, so we had to set up a system with a script that says these might be all the same word as the one that we're using, and or the word that they're using might match this number of words in our set, and so on. And then when you have a link, a positive match, you just click, and then everything gets folded together automatically. So that's wonderful too. Okay, just to summarize, technology-aided philology allows us to trace language development over time and track terms in context to understand their evolving meaning, see structures, genre features, highlight heretofore less well understood ontologies, enhance, international collaboration. We have these online interfaces for distance research collaboration, and empower native speakers access and preservation to these important records, because language is power. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. And next speaker will be Richard Furuta. He's professor in the Department of Computer Science at Texas A&M University. He's director of the Center for the Study of Digital Libraries and director of the Hypermedia Research Lab there. His current research areas include digital libraries, digital humanities, and structured documents. And he has participated in the digital humanities through a number of projects, including the Cervantes and Picasso projects. He'll talk about that and in general, the relationship between computer science and humanities. Dr. Furuta.
Well, I didn't notice this, Stephanie, on your slide before, the little red Interrational collaboration. I think that is perfect. I like that.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, many collaborations are not very rational. Is this one mine? See if this is mine or if this is someone else's. Okay, and if one of the things of computer scientists is you're always, in the 80s and 90s, we were always asked to fix people's PCs. And so consequently, most of us have stopped using PCs. So, this is going to be kind of an interesting experience for me because I always get confused as to where I am looking on these things. So I want to make a couple of points here. One, just in preference. One is I am coming at this from the standpoint of computer science as opposed to coming from the perspective of the humanities. So this is one of these cases where in Abigail's diagram of the Cheshire Cat, which was labeled the software developer, we would do it the other way around. We'd label that cat the humanist, and we'd be down there like owls, looking up and trying to figure out what was going on. And I think that's really one of the things that we find with computer scientists in general is that they have it takes a lot of learning on both sides to do a collaboration. You have to both have a humanist who's interested in collaborating with the computer scientist, but also the other way around. And the second thing is that the projects that I'm talking about are very much, in some sense, ones that are quiescent right now. These are ones that we've done starting in about 1995. And for the large part at this point, what's going on with them is that as opposed to collaborating on the technology right now, we're in a place where the humanists are working with the tools and putting things into it. So the computer science involvement is not really quite as active as it was at that point. But so this is in a sense a perspective based on the experience with those particular tools. The other thing that I want to do is, since I always tend to put way too much into a half-hour talk, is also talk a little bit about something that I've been thinking about over the last couple of months, which is the question of I think for background, you have to know that computer scientists, even though we talk about computer science, I don't think we really have a very strong understanding within our own departments what we do. Okay, I think we have, so it's such a broad area that I think we have disagreements in terms of what's important, what you focus on, what you ignore. And that's even worse when we start talking about collaborations, because I think that from the outside we look like a fairly cohesive group, but we're really not. So I want to talk a little bit about this question of what's involved in computer science and where is it that humanists interact with that. And so I think that's the second topic there. So there's three primary collections that they come to mind when I start to think about the ones that I've done over the last 15 years. The Cervantes project, which has been pretty much started in 1995 or so, gone through a number of iterations, a number of different projects with Dr. Eduardo Urbina over in Hispanic Studies at Texas A&M. Digital Done, which is a relatively short-term, 3-4 year type of project we did kind of on the side with Gary Stringer, who's was in the English department there and has since moved to an institution in South Carolina. And then Nahuatl Archaeology Digital Library, which is pretty much the most recent project we had been working on through about a year or two ago. Felipe Castro in nautical archaeology, and this is one that we're currently trying to move along also in terms of future work. So the Cervantes project has as its focus bringing the work of the author of Don Quixote into a digital form on the web. And one of the second project, I think probably starting about 1999 and going through about 2004, 2005, was to try to bring online as many different copies of the significant early editions of the Don Quixote as possible. So these are the 1605 and 1615 first printings, along with other printings that were possibly influenced by Cervantes while he was alive. So ones that were printed either during his lifetime or immediately after he died. And there's two components here, the Vary and the MVED. So I'm going to try seeing if I can find a mouse here. There it is. See if I click on this, what happens. Okay, so this is basically what you'd see when you go to Cervantes tamu.edu. And then what we find for this is the additions. And because this is work that was done a few years ago, some parts are, suffering from bit rot, but mostly it's still there. And this is one of these kinds of things where we need to try to get through it and look at it. So the kinds of facilities we're providing there were pretty much a combination of text and image, multiple editions. Take the 1605 princeps there. First copy, we can see it as text, we can see it as image, except that we need a plugin to display the content. And then we can see it in text and image. And if we were seeing it in text and image with this plugin, what we would be able to do is to click over here, and the image would move you to the page that you were looking at, and then vice versa. You click on the image, and it moves you back into the transcription. Let's see now. So how do I get back to my PowerPoint? This is the part. Let's try that guy. Let's see what he does. This is the part where I say, "This isn't a Mac, isn't it?" So all this is technology that we built at that particular time, synchronizing the two small tools to allow the synchronization of lines of the transcription to the lines of the text and so on and so forth. And then there's a standalone program that runs on a PC to allow an editor to put in information, and I forgot to show you that, so let me see if I can figure out how to do that. Let's see. Well, basically what you get is you get a copy of the text, but instead you can now say that I want to see the documentary text, or I want to see text that's been produced by a particular editor. The variants are highlighted. Click on a variant and it brings up for you the different readings and what they all are. You can again follow those through to see the different sources and so on from the texts here. So that's the first project. Then secondly, the thing that we started looking at then was work of John Donne, and this is of Gary Stringer. And again, here what we have is a set of the poems of Donne, a initial set of description of what's going on, a index of all the poems, so you can pick one of them and see what it looks like in the text and the transcription. I think these are also linked with magnifications of various kinds. And you have a concordance, which, if I can find it, shows you all the terms and where they appear in the text. And again, that can be followed to the different elements. This was an interesting project just from a technological standpoint. I think I mentioned it to someone recently, in that what we discovered here is that these are texts that were, many of them were owned by Texas A&M to start with, so these are in-house scans. And we discovered that the scanners that we were using, let me put it this way, that the purpose of most technology, commercial technology, is to get rid of differences. Okay, so the purpose of a scanner is to get rid of imperfections, to give you a picture of the text. And here what Gary really wanted to look at is he wanted to look at the imperfections. He wanted to see the artifacts that were left by the printing process, the place where the chain goes across the, how the paper's made and the way it's oriented and things like that. And so what we ended up doing is we ended up taking, I think it was a $50,000 scanner that the library owned, and disabling half of its lights. So that instead of giving us a shadow-free picture, it gave us one that had shadows, so that we could see artifacts in terms of the page. And I think the same thing goes through many, many different humanities projects, is that the focus is on the differences. In some sense, much as the difference between a library and a museum. In a museum, everything is a primary object. Everything is something that you want to have as separate. In a library, things tend to get put together into categories. So this is one of the things that we thought was an interesting characteristic of the domain that meant something that was different between what you would expect from today's technology and what you would find in technology the applications for the kinds of texts we were talking about. The third project I'm going to talk about very briefly here is the Nautical Archaeology Digital Library. And from an initial standpoint, this doesn't necessarily sound like it's the same kind of project. It sounds to me, it sounds to a lot of people that it's people with ships and scuba diving gear and that kind of thing, finding artifacts, putting them together. But what we found when working in this project is that again, there was an opportunity to use the same techniques that we had developed in the literary context, in the archaeological context, specifically centering around the shipbuilding treatises. These are essentially instruction manuals, how you put together a ship, that were written in 1500 to 1600 type of time frame. The person we're working with here, Felipe Castro, is a specialist in terms of wooden ships, European wooden ships in particular. And so he's working in terms of ships that go through about, I think, the end of the 1700s. That's roughly when they started switching to metal ships instead of wooden ships. And so our public site here again includes a collection of shipbuilding treatises, the documents that you are able to find out that tell you about the process of building ships, including some. Well, there's a page in a second, including some wonderful details about the form of the tree that you need to cut down in order to build the ship, things like that. It does not yet include things like textual transcriptions. That's something that is hoped to be a future type of process, nor does it include, so it's basically a viewer. If you look at the site, it will be just a viewer of images by itself. This is telling us about treaties. So this is pointing out that treatises have a mix between a literary document and a scientific document. They have a combination of textual descriptions of things like ships, but they also have formulas and math and illustrations and geometry and things like that involved, or as I said, practical things about the form of the structure, the form of the materials to be used. So one of the goals in this project was to try to tie these pieces together to allow them to be used together. And we centered here on a couple of things. One is that the terminology that's being used in the treatises varies from country to country, from year to year. And so we needed to form ourselves a multilingual glossary in those terms. So to do that, we used a community-based approach where different members of the community would take responsibility for different languages, would enter definitions. Those would then be linked together to refer to the same, to refer to common terms. We didn't really deal with some of the uncertainty questions. There's research in computer science now about uncertainty that I think is relevant, but we didn't get into it. And some of the uncertainty involves how terms change over time, how one term will cover several concepts and in another language or another time will be separated into different terms. Very similar in some ways to things that you see in biology in terms of how species are defined and how splitting and lumping occurs in terms of those kinds of relationships. And I think this is one of these areas where you start to wonder if there are other disciplines that also should be involved in terms of the collaboration. When you start to ask the question of how is it that this concept has moved over time and is related to other concepts and is put together, but we're not really sure exactly how it works and how we're going to fit them together. And we've got different viewpoints and different theories about it. Then we start, it starts feeling like a question you can take to some of the areas in the sciences that have that problem. I mean, the genetics or something like that, to see what you can do in terms in those senses. The other thing that we have then, because it's a ship, is we had access to a database that had been put together by a fellow named Dick Steffi, who went through the literature of wooden ships and classified all the characteristics of the formation of those ships. He had put them kind of in a home-built database. The structure was a little bit sloppy, overlapped, a little bit ambiguous, but the student who did a dissertation on this worked on that and came up with a more reasoned ontology, a different representation of that material that he then used to define how the ship fit together and all of its pieces, the nails and the boards and the type of boards and so on and so forth related to each other. And then those terms were in turn tied back to the glossary that we're talking about. And as well, he developed some fairly rudimentary image mapping tools, so you could take a picture and you could say this corresponds to here, and now we've got a situation where you can go from a treatise and a description of something in the treatise to the ship, to illustrations of the ship, to discussion of how the pieces fit together into a higher level type of form, and so on and so forth, through this representation of a ship. And we'll see the same idea come up again in a minute in the Cervantes project. So the observations here are that from my standpoint, it's been very helpful to have had the opportunity to have looked at multiple projects with multiple collaborators in multiple areas, because each one of these projects reflects the personality of both myself and also the person in the domain. And so this would mean that and we all have our own particular preferences in terms of how we want to do things. But when you start dealing with a number of them, you kind of start seeing that there's commonalities. Before we did these projects with the Humanists, we were working with botanists in doing herbarium records. And there's a lot of commonality in terms of the way that that you see materials there and that you see materials here. This is, I think, possibly, I think a collaboration also, at least in our campus, the collaboration was a three-legged collaboration. We had ourselves in computer science, we had humanists, and then we had the library. And the library was a source of, in essence, a way of making sure that we kept other areas in mind. Because the library has two functions. One is it's the only institution on our campus that has a mandate to keep things. So, I mean, that's important. And the second is it's one of the few institutions on campus that has the mandate to deal with everyone. So that's, those are both important things. I think that what we're seeing in the humanities and also previously in the sciences is a shift from what's important, how do we put it? There's a shift from saying that the important thing when you have data, when you have information, is to keep it. Okay, so it used to be that the idea is you'd gain a reputation by having a manuscript you couldn't let anyone else see, or having a collection you couldn't, having the Dead Sea Scrolls and not letting anyone else look at them. To instead being a contribution of sharing. So now you get attention, you get value out of being a person who makes things available to everyone. So I think that's an important shift in terms of the dynamic. Along with that goes a shift, in essence, between the model of who's in charge and how things are shared. So I think that one of the things that you see is a change from perhaps the strict editor relationship to one where it's more of a community, where maybe there's not necessarily a single person who's in charge. And then you get the questions of how do you maintain scholarly integrity and all those kinds of nasty questions, and that leads into the hypertextual question of how do you know when you have learned something? Because the difference between a hypertext and a regular text is a regular text, you pick up a book and you read it and you know it all. Hypertext, here you are encountering information in the wild, and you just read until you feel like you know enough. So it's a question of all those are interesting kinds of things that get involved. The publication limits, you start having to rethink things because you're no longer worried about how many pages you're going to use, how thick something is, how expensive it's going to be, how heavy it's going to be. And so you have the ability now to put in materials that include original sources and things like that. But it all challenges what we think every day. You need flexibility to blur, again, as I was saying, then the role of the editor and the reader, and I think one of the things that Juxta did in its earlier form is it showed very nicely how that blurring occurs, because the readers started becoming the editors and so on. There's a question in terms of customizing or using standards. Different skills of the team and organization tie into this. The thing is that with computers, everyone is dealing with black boxes. Okay, so the humanist is dealing with black boxes. Computer scientist is dealing with black boxes. The difference is our boxes are different. A humanist might be looking at the computer and might view, say, Microsoft Word as a unit, as a black box. Might view WordPress as a black box, as a unit. Computer scientist is likely to look at that same thing and say, but wait a minute, I know how this is put together. It's really a set of smaller pieces. And but at the same time, the computer scientist is likely to reach a point where, again, he or she sees a black box. For example, most programmers these days will see the library function as a black box that you use to put something together. More traditional computer scientists in software will probably say, once you start getting to the point where you're talking about the operating system or below that I don't know anything about that. I'm not going to worry about that, or the structure of the compiler, how they put that thing together, how they define the language. So the C++ language is a black box, maybe. And what this means is that we all, you have to, I think that it's an advantage to be able to look at this and say, ask the times when the box matches what you want and when the box doesn't match what you want. I think it's far too easy on all levels, programmer, scholar, to say, I'm going to change what I'm doing because this is the easiest way to do it. And that raises issues that needs to be thought of, and cost and time being two of them. The third thing is that because we had multiple projects, we actually found that the same code was used for all of them, which is why when you look at the Cervantes, original Cervantes material I showed you, and then the Dunn, there's a very strong commonality between how they work, even though the appearance is different. The same basic underlying code runs underneath that. We didn't use the TEI for a couple of reasons. And I think these are also practical reasons. One is that we were dealing with legacy transformations in a lot of cases. In the case of the Dunn project, these are text files that have been put together, transcriptions or files that have been put together over a period of maybe 20 years by a community of Dunn scholars. And they had invented their own notation. They had invented their own ways of doing things. So that was something that it just seemed to be too hard. And then the second thing is as Abigail pointed out, the TEI can take an awful lot of effort. And when you, it's especially for someone starting out a project, it's very hard to justify mentally the need to take that amount of effort. It's just, later on maybe you find that you want to have done that, but initially we didn't. We did try some approaches. We have a master's thesis from back in 2001 where a student tried to do an automatic transformation of text to some of the simpler layers of the TEI, the things that are like paragraphs and boldface and stuff like that. And also, more recently in the Cervantes project, there's been a recognition that there's some projects that would benefit from a TEI marked up version. So I believe that they've put together at least a Spanish version that has some rudimentary TEI. And the reason that they did that was a new project that started out probably about 2005 and went with NEH funding. The first one was with NSF funding, and went to maybe about 2008, 2009, dealing with the iconography of the Cervantes. So in this case, our Rare Books Library, our Cushing Library, purchased, I think it was something like 600 volumes or 600 editions of Don Quixote, which and they were picked specifically for ones that had nice, reasonable, that had important illustrations. And so we've gone through the process of digitizing those illustrations. There's an art historian who comes over from Spain on a yearly basis and is adding metadata to them and so on and so forth. This is a project that is one where the primary activity now is in putting in new materials. But so this is basically the browsing interface, and you can find this again off the Cervantes site. Is you have a list of the editions. If you bring up, click on the picture on the left-hand side, you'll see the illustrations within that. The ones in red right here actually are, I think, ones that may not have metadata, but or they may have metadata. I don't remember exactly how it is. And the metadata itself looks something like this in terms of what's there. Now, the key field that I think is important here is the one that's titled the subject. Okay. What this is a higher level representation, in a sense, a ontology of the Quixote, one that lists all of the chapters. If you click on one of the chapters, you see the episodes within that chapter. And then the really neat thing is that if you now click on any of these levels, you see all the illustrations that are tied to that particular episode. So if you click here on the first thing, Don Quixote in his library reading his novels, and you click on that and you see all the pictures across the collection that are involved in that. What we'd like to do is we'd like to also be able to jump from there to the text, from the text to maybe another translation, and then back to the illustrations using this essential high-level kind of framework as the map between those pieces. And that's where we started to find some use in terms of TEI encoding, so that's where that's going there. Let's see, so I think I've got about 5 minutes here. I just want to say very quickly about computer science, digital humanities. There's a neat project called the Computing Ontology Project that Boots Castle and some other people, Larry Snyder from University of Washington, it's one of them, carried out, in which they tried to take all of computing, which is the larger area that is computer science plus everything else that's related to computers, which would be information science, would be information technology, those kinds of things, and figure out if there was another way of mapping the topics there into some sort of structure. Now, what they did initially is they did the straightforward thing. They took, I think, the ACM classification of topics and went through and described topics involved with all of those. Came up with about 3,000 topics, 17 top-level areas, and they said, this is too complicated. This just doesn't seem to be what we're trying to do. They then went through and tried to do a very simple thing of, I think it was theory, people, systems, and I forget, applications or something like that, and use that. And then that was too simple. It didn't work. So what they did is they did an exercise where they sat down and took all 3,000 terms independently, went through, and each of them put them on pieces of paper, little slips of paper, put them into piles. And then they, without thinking about what the names were for the piles or anything like that, then they came together afterwards and discovered that the piles they had put together were relatively related to, everyone had come up with sort of the same piles, And in fact, there are only about 7 different areas that they have found. And so these are basically the areas which are shown in this picture. So you've got here things like organizational context, which is management of computers, technology resources, things like requirements analysis for software engineering, computing infrastructure, which is the operating systems, the computer, the hardware, things like that. Software design and information, which is what you would probably think of as both programming languages, but also software engineering. Theory, which they say is not only the mathematical theory that underlies everything, but some of the other theories, psychological theories and things like that people might use. Information recollection, which is information retrieval, sorts of things. Interaction, human-computer interaction types of things. And then policies, practices, and societal issues. So I think the interesting thing then is to go through and say to yourself, what does computer science actually cover in this? And you see that there's some areas here, most of these areas I have a big circle. If I thought computer science covered all of it, and lesser if not. And so for example, computer science only does a little bit of, say, the societal issues, I think, in most traditional programs. Only a little bit of organization and management, but a lot of the interaction and things like that. Now you look at information science and you see a similar but slightly different kind of set of focuses, maybe a bit more concerned about how people are using the computers than computer scientists might have. And then the interesting thing for me is to look at digital humanities and how it centers in terms of the broad scope of computer science. And so this raises a couple of questions, I think, for me. One is the point that very few computer scientists have a deep understanding of all of this. Most of us focus in one of these areas and not all of the areas. And so, for example, if you have a problem that is primarily one of trying to figure out how people are using something, how they're designing something, and you get a theoretician who's mostly interested in the mathematical underpinnings, that's not going to be a very happy collaboration. Or vice versa. I mean, if you have someone who, so this is a case where I think that many of the digital humanities projects that to me feel unsatisfying are ones where essentially it's, there's this thing called Maslow's rule, which says that if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So it's those kinds of cases where, but it also means that there's probably a certain number of areas here where there's fertile ground. I mean, there's areas where interactions are going to help an awful lot do things that are currently hard to do. The second, the other points I want to make here is that the collaborations, in order to be the most successful, need to, in some sense, need to be faculty at that level. In essence, working with a programmer is very easy and it's very productive, but it's a lot like a computer scientist getting a technical writer and saying that I now am doing English literature. You know, there's a problem with working with faculty members, which is that they're hard to work with, and so that's an issue involved with that. And I think there's 3 open questions that I think they're ones that I've been puzzling about lately, and I don't have any answers. The first one is, if you were to now try, instead of trying to do this collaboration, you were trying to find a way of training digital humanists so they could be effective in carrying out both activities, how much computer science would you have to teach them? And it's obvious that you don't have to teach them all of computer science. It's obvious that some of the stuff we do in computer science is totally irrelevant, not only to the digital humanities, but also to other areas of computer science. So that's a tough question, is what can you do to maybe take a 4-year type of curriculum and make it into a 2-year type of curriculum, for the first thing. The second is, on the higher level, are there other areas of computing that can contribute to the humanities? One of the big buzzwords for the last 5 years has been computational thinking. Is that a compatible idea, or is that basically totally at odds with humanistic thinking? I mean, is it something that would not work at all? And there are other types of things in terms of the specific areas. And the thing that's always puzzled me actually is why the humanities have not made more of a have not had more of an effect in computer science, in computing. Are there ideas like computational thinking in the humanities that one would apply to computer science to change the way in which computer science is carried out? The only example I can really think of, I mean, there's the obvious thing that people trained in the humanities have become well-known and famous computer scientists. But the only thing that really jumped to my mind was Knuth's literate programming, which is an effort from when he was building tech in Metafont and those things, in which he said, I'm going to now view the process of writing a program as if I were writing a novel. And so he built a set of tools, Tangle and Weave, that take input and produce two kinds of outputs. One is a compilable program, and the other is essentially the documentation in book form. But still, that has, I think, not quite the total connection between the two. It's more of a technological view of how to apply. So anyway, those are the three open questions that I think are ones that would be, at least to me, very fascinating to try to figure out. So I think at that point I'm past my time, and I'm also out of slides, so I'll stop. Thank you.
Questions? Are there some questions for Stephanie and Dr. Furuta? Anybody comments there? Questions? You were doing all the words. Are you then also trying to translate the documents?
Yes.
Themselves?
So we have a manuscript. We have a couple of manuscript projects. One's largely alphabetic texts, and then largely pictographical texts. So once we have those transcribed and translated, then we can harvest from those for the dictionary.
It goes back and forth in a way. That's what I was thinking.
Feed each other in some ways.
Right.
Yeah.
Trying to figure out the meaning and the context.
Exactly.
Yes.
The question is for, I forget the name.
Rich.
Yeah. Going to the concept of black box.
Yeah.
Where does database design or knowledge about databases fit in terms of your experience?
So I mean, the whole reason for black boxes is that none of us can keep track of everything. So I think when you look at databases, if you look at the way that computer scientists look at databases versus the way that, say, business school looks at databases, it'll kind of give you a sense of where those boundaries are, because computer science, I seem to remember, I don't know if Art was responsible for this back when my master's program, but I seem to remember we had to put together a database system in something like Lisp or something like that as a term project. But that means that we're looking at it not so much in terms of how you form the queries and how you do that sort of thing. We're looking at what happens underneath the hood once you actually make a request. So I mean, there's a lot of kinds of areas where you could be looking at it just from the standpoint of I guess, think of maybe three levels. One is how it's put together. The second is what those queries, SQL queries, might look at. And the third might be some sort of application layer where you've got a interface that you use to just click on and things happen. So, but each of those is going to affect how you think about the problem and how you solve the problem. And the counter of that is that if you pick one that's low level, you'll spend all of your time doing a very small amount of stuff. So that's kind of
I loved your diagram of computing ontology. That fired off all kinds of bells for me. That I'm going to think of more. But I was wondering, I guess from a research funding perspective, I mean, the conversations I've had with NSF officers is the kind of things that I do are not considered to be basic research, but they actually connect to some of the components or topic areas that you describe. I mean, so how broadly accepted is this notion of this is the field of computer science, or is this just kind of A&M's vision?
well, I mean, unfortunately, I wasn't involved in creating the computing ontology, so it's at least us in Villanova, and so yeah. And this NSF thing has always been a tough thing. There are some people, obviously, who are able to make the claim the ability how the work they're doing in the humanities is NSF fundable. And Greg Crane, for example, is the canonical example of that. So it's a matter really of the humanities, what they have from the standpoint of computer science, is a lot of really great questions, a lot of really great problems. And I think in particular the problems that are tough to figure out are the ones that you can do as science. I think particularly the problems that you have and also that biology has, for example, that's even better science. So it's kind of the difficulty we have had with NSF funding for humanities projects is that then our goal is very much one of producing research results. And producing research results is not necessarily compatible with producing a system that is durable.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions for Stephanie. That's a fascinating project. And you alluded a couple of times to what we all know, that language changes over time and that there's a different historical component. So I was wondering if you have plans for using digital technology to help display the historical evolution of words over time, since you're building this dictionary and it sounds as though you've got a lot of historical resources at your disposal. And my second question is somewhat related. It's a methodological question about using live witnesses as you're constructing definitions of language. At the University of Kentucky, we've got an endangered language group that's been working with Shugni, and apparently they brought the Shugni speakers, I think there may be 7 of them still, I'm probably getting this wrong, and they started asking them what words meant, and apparently a vigorous debate turned into near bloodshed over the definitions of words. And so I'm wondering what your methodological considerations are as you invite living speakers to define words.
Yes, well, I'll start with question 2 first, because it brings to mind we recently had our first encounter. Well, we had one preliminary one in Pasadena last fall, and then in December we had a really structured meeting where we tried to invite people who spoke variants from 8 different states in Mexico. No one ever in history had brought native speakers together from different variants to see if they could communicate. So we really knew we could be lighting a power keg here, or it could be a complete fizzle. Oh, they wouldn't understand each other. Then what would we do for a week? We had planned, they're all in hotels and we have all these rooms reserved. But sure enough, they understood each other. And they were very polite, but there were some arguments and some tears. And but I think, they were, like I said, these are people now who are at university level and, educated, and some are published poets. One's a famous singer who writes his lyrics in novels. So really interesting, traveled, interesting people who, anyway, they handled it very well, very professionally, respectfully.
I guess my question is, how do you represent those differences in the project?
Yeah, well, what we did was we videotaped and audio recorded the whole thing, and now they're in the process. Each person who contributed is asked to transcribe their own contributions. We also had it very structured over vocabulary, but first around themes, rather than, this specific word, what does it mean to you? Because we found that kind of falls flat. They'll say that word, oh, I don't know that word. But if it comes up in a conversation that's thematically organized, they figure out right away what that word is, and they're like, oh yeah, and it's like this word that we have. And so the conversation, that natural flow seemed to be best. We also tried to get the audio and video, the video especially focused on the mouth so we could see tongue and teeth and, how things are pronounced, because for linguists that's important. So we tried to capture all of that. So they're transcribing it now, and then we are going to clip the video and insert into the dictionary things that we thought were especially illustrative of the regional variants, or how they might be, oh, this is the same in so many places, or and why are these different, the questions that were raised. I think we have a massive amount of data from just this 1 week-long encounter. It's going to take us a very long time to process process it, but also as we go through it, then we'll plan the next encounter, and we're going to try to include more variants, and well, it's very ambitious. But the other thing is tracing language change over time. Fortunately, there is a little work that's been done in this that we're currently just, that has helped us organize what to watch for, but we're also finding new things. So yes, we will eventually publish our findings on. But right now, there's a scholar who established stage 1, 2, and 3, over this 300-year period, and has identified certain marked, patterns of change. And we're seeing, yes, we find that. But we're also finding, over in this part of Mexico, they didn't quite follow that pattern. It's periphery versus center and things like that. So it's wonderful historical linguistics goal that we have among many other goals. Thanks.
Yes.
This is an intentionally naive question, and that is the phrase endangered language, which of course goes along with endangered species, or it could be endangered prints of movies made in the 1930s, or whatever it might be. So what exactly is the account or theory of loss and value that underlies such projects, that is to prevent the quote endangered from becoming extinct? What is it? What is it that people who want to do this kind of thing fear, and what is it that they value?
That's an issue that would be interesting to hear. There are probably many answers to that question, and it is deeper than it's. I know it sounds simple, but it isn't. And but I think the greatest concern is that human language variation is precious in that it's a window onto ways of thinking and culture. And so every time we lose a language, we lose an opportunity to understand other ways of seeing and thinking. And so, and yet there were many critics, in fact, even here in our linguistics department, they had applied for an endangered language grant as well, and we got it, and they didn't, and we aren't linguists, we're historians, but, and they're trying to document a language that has 60 speakers, and we have 4 million, so obviously there are languages that are more endangered than others, closer to extinction. Like, we had a student working on our team who said, oh, my grandmother was the last speaker of our language on the coast here in Oregon, and it's just a profound sadness when you hear that it's gone. There are still some language materials and some audio recordings, and we can still try to get at their ways of seeing and thinking through those materials, but it's not the same as having native speakers still who can explain things to us. So that's a short answer, maybe too simplistic.
I don't know. Thank you very much.
That's great.
Sorry, I have a question for you, Professor Wood. Did the Nahuatl speakers have access to this dictionary? Did they have good access to it? And could you put it in a cheap format like a Kindle or something?
Yes.
So that it would be
They have access because they're helping build it, and it's online for free. Everyone has access. But for those who don't have access to the internet or a computer, that's a problem. So yes, we figured at the end of these 3 years we would call it edition 1. It's always, everything digital is dynamic. That's another wonderful thing about digital textualities, is they're dynamic. I think it's wonderful because you can always make them larger and more complicated and more examples. But we're going to call it edition 1 and make a CD, something like that, for free distribution to native speakers who don't have access to internet, say. But we'll have to be periodically creating those discs, so that because it's always changing so fast. But thank you for thinking about that, because I think the digital divide, socially and culturally, is huge. It's really important. Exactly.
Yeah, one last question, and we'll take a break for about 10 minutes before.
Have you thought about doing a spatial mapping where regions in Mexico or elsewhere are particularly concentrated and others which are more
Yes.
diffuse?
Yes, I think, for instance, when we're mapping change over time, but we could also show it regionally on a map. I think, I love GIS, and some of the things that you've done, Jim, are just so impressive that it's planted little seeds. Like, how can we show this visually?
Would you guess that there are concentrated regions? I mean, it sounds like it, but is that basically what's happening here? With this
There's a lot of
development?
migration concentration, so it becomes fuzzy with, you know, people moving around, but definitely you know, the state of Guerrero, there's a real concentration with certain unique characteristics in their variant. And then, you know, the Eastern Huasteca Nahuatl is the one that we've chosen as our primary set of examples of modern day language because they are the most speakers of any of the variants. But we want to include the other larger variants especially. And then if there are some really tiny, unusual variant, that could be illustrative too. Sometimes you get those things that are so outside the norm that they bring to mind, you know, the ooze, as William McCarty calls it. The ooze is what's super interesting sometimes, because it doesn't fit the mold.
Okay, we'll take a 10-minute break before our main speaker, but our commentary today.